Well, hello everybody and welcome aboard. It's Rob from PMDG back with another tutorial episode for our Douglas DC-6 for Microsoft Flight Simulator. If you've never flown a piston airliner for real, this is going to be the most important tutorial you watch, because this time we're going to teach you how to slow the airplane down appropriately so you can get it configured to land. There's a lot to cover, a short time to do it, so let's get started. We're going to go right to the whiteboard because this is a visual exercise primarily. When we left off after the last episode, we had finished our descent and we were now level at 3,000 feet and descent power. And out in front of us, there's a runway. And so we've got a certain amount of distance between us and the time we have to actually start descending in order to be able to touch down on that runway. Now we're going to use the Aerosoft scenery for EDLP, or Paderborn Airport. The final approach fix at Paderborn for runway 6 is Comil intersection, and unsurprisingly it's at 3,000 feet. That's why I chose it. We hit the bottom of our descent process at about 240 knots as we started to level out at 300 feet. We're going to have to use the real estate between the airplane and Comil to slow the airplane to about 140 knots so that we can start to get configured for landing. The question is, how do you do that? Well, it probably won't come as a surprise, but in order to slow from 240 to 140 knots, there's two things that we're going to be using. We're going to use power and we're going to use drag. Now, like everything in aviation, there's about 15 different ways to do things, and if you'd like, you can leave the automatic flight engineer engaged. It will take the airplane about 40 miles to slow down. We don't want to do that. What we're going to do instead is we're going to make a power adjustment right after leveling off, and we're going to set 90 BMEP as our power setting. This is going to start the airplane slowing, and it's going to bring us down to 174 knots, which is the speed at which we can start adding drag. By adding drag, what I mean is we're going to go from flaps up to flaps 10, and then we're going to go to flaps 15, and then we're going to go to flaps 20, and that increase in drag is going to be all we need to get us down to about 140 knots. The next question up is, how long should it take? Well, to slow from 240 to 140, it should take us about 15 miles. And I like to add about a 5 nautical mile buffer in there. So plan your level segment to be about 20 miles. So we want to start slowing 20 miles from Comil. That'll give us plenty of time. So here we are, we're back in the airplane. We've just leveled out at 3,000 feet. In the level off, we've consumed a little bit of distance, and we've also eaten some of our speed. We're already slowing down pretty quickly because the power is fairly significantly back. You can see we're at our descent power stage. We're a little bit over 100 BMEP, and the speed's slowing nicely. A little trick, 110 BMEP in this airplane is a little bit more power than it wants in this stage. And once we get to about 196 knots, it's really not going to slow down for us all that much more. It will, but it takes forever. So here's what you do when you fly radial engine airplanes. We're going to take the throttles away from the automated flight engineer for a moment. And now watch as I start to bring the BMEP needle back to about 90. And I'm just doing that by bringing the throttle back really, really slowly. You can also do this by adjusting RPM. I recommend doing it with the throttle for a small adjustment like this. It keeps it pretty simple, and it leaves the props at the low RPM setting, which is nice and quiet in the cabin and quiet in the airport environment too, which is important in noise sensitive areas. But we're back at 90 BMEP now, and you can see we've got just over 14 miles to go to Comil. The speed is bleeding off just nicely. We're passing through 185 knots. We've got about 10 knots to go before we can start adding drag. How do I know this? This placard here shows that we can go from flaps 0 to flaps 30 once we reach 174 knots. And now the astute will probably look at this and say, well, hey, what about the white arc? Because in GA, the white arc is where you can put your flaps out. On a DC-6, the white arc is where you can go to landing flaps, which is anything greater than 30 degrees of flap. Now our speed is slowing through 185. At about 10 knots, we're going to add flaps, and we're only going to go 1 notch. Checking on our distance here. Things are coming along just fine. You'll notice the speed's not bleeding off rapidly, which is fine. We're leaving the power where it is. We're coming up on 174 knots. And we're just kind of letting the airplane settle itself out. We're not rushing it. We're not taking any risks by pulling the power to idle. We're just planning ahead and letting the airplane slow. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to add 10 degrees of flaps. And you'll notice as we do, the airplane pitches down slightly, but the rate at which we start to shed speed is going to increase. And again, you just kind of have to wait for it. But you expect now that with that first notch of flaps, you're going to lose about 10 knots of speed. And when you get to about 155, which is where we are, 165, which is where we are now, we add 1 more notch of flaps and we go to 15 degrees. So we'll put that in now. And you'll notice the airplane pitches down a little bit more. It starts to shed speed again a little bit faster. And again, we could do this all in one shot, but it's a huge trim exercise. We're professionals. We don't want to do that to our passengers. As we come up on 155 knots now, we go ahead and we add another notch and we go to flaps 20. And at this point, the speed is going to settle just beautifully, right to about 140 knots. And you can see we still have got just under 7 nautical miles to go before we get to Comil, and we've shed 100 knots from our initial level off speed when we were leveling off at 3,000 feet. And that's a pretty big deal. We took our time. We knew it was going to take us about 15 nautical miles to do it. And here we are basically on speed and on profile, and we've still got about 5 nautical miles to go. So even if it took us a little bit longer or we've got a little bit of a tailwind, we've still got plenty of room by using a 20 nautical mile level flight segment before we start down for the runway. So to review, when you reach your level off, disengage the automatic flight engineer, bring your throttle back gently until you see 90 BMEP. The airplane will slow to 174 knots, add flaps 10, add flaps 15, add flaps 20. Shortly after that, you'll be at 140 knots and ready to start your descent to the runway. If you do it right, it should take about 15 miles to accomplish that speed change. Alright, I think that's enough for today. Next up, we're going to be doing landings. As always, thank you for flying PMDG. Be well, be good to one another, fly safely. We'll see you next time.